Joining us right now, defense attorney, Harvard Law professor, author of Trumped Up, Criminalization of Politics Endangers Democracy, Alan Dershowitz, back with us. Alan, good to see you.
Good to see you.
And of course, you wrote the book on this. How long ago? Tell us about this book that you wrote.
About 11 years ago, I wrote a book called Preemption, indicating whether or not it would be legal for a president to launch a nuclear attack preemptively in order to prevent. For example, in 1991, the Iraqis threatened to send germ warfare against our soldiers fighting against Saddam Hussein. And President George Bush, the first, made it clear, you use any medical weapons, any of these biological weapons, we will nuke Baghdad. And so the case went all the way up to the International Criminal, the International Court of Justice. And they ruled that if a nation's defense is at stake, nuclear weapons are validly used, otherwise not. So what this general said, in some respects, is a cliche. Of course, every American soldier has an obligation to obey the law. The problem I have is why he had to say it. By saying it, he reduces the deterrent power of the President of the United States to decide when and under what circumstances to threaten or use nuclear weapons to defend America.
It's undermining. It undermines the president.
And especially at a time when we keep sending mixed messages to the Koreans. There's differences of opinion between the Secretary of State and the president, and now you have this general. How dangerous is this at a moment like this when Korea is getting mixed messages from the United States, and we have potentially an unhinged person leading that country?
We have to speak with one voice and one clear voice in order for deterrence to be maintained. Look, the problem with nuclear weapons is you cannot launch a nuclear weapon without killing thousands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of innocent civilians. And it's not like other weapons. It's very hard to launch it strategically, tactically, and in a limited way. So, of course, we all agree it should be used only as a last resort. But the president has to have the power to deter and to make sure that the other side knows that if they dare to think about or dire about launching a nuclear attack on the United States, the consequences will be dire.
And is this general telling it like it is? What was the conclusion in your book about whether a president can be overruled by a general in a case like this?
Every officer of the United States Army has an obligation under the Nuremberg principles not to do anything unlawful. If hypothetically you had a mad president who said, you know, let's bomb Great Britain, I don't like the way they're dealing with the United States, of course every officer would have an obligation to do that. Look, we once had an insane Secretary of Defense, a man named Forrestal, and of course his generals understood. You know, he jumped out of a building, killed himself eventually. He thought the Russians were coming to get him. You need to have soldiers who are prepared in extreme cases to refuse to obey unlawful orders, but not to announce that in advance, not to say something that could be easily misunderstood. This could be misunderstood as saying, if in my opinion, I think this is the wrong time, I'm going to overrule the president. That's not the way it operates.
What kind of precedent do we have for a general saying anything like this publicly?
It shouldn't be done. Generals should be seen but not heard when it comes to issues of this kind. Everybody knows what the law is. There's no reason to announce it to our opponents, which sounds like he's constraining the power of the president.
Yep, because it's undermining the president. So let me turn to former FBI James Comey. He's reportedly heading out on a speaking tour, highlighting ethics and leadership. Your thoughts?
Well, I think he first ought to take a course in ethics in leadership before he goes out and talks about it. Look, he's a good man. He's a decent man. I've known him for years. He's a Boy Scout. He really is. But he has made more mistakes in the past couple of years than any FBI director in modern history. And if he gets out there and says, let me talk to you about how I've learned from my mistakes, that would be an interesting tour. But to start lecturing other people on ethics without acknowledging his own mistakes, and his mistakes have been bipartisan. Yeah. Let me tell you, he made mistakes about Hillary Clinton. He made mistakes about President Trump.
Since you are an author, a prolific one, does this sell books? Because ultimately, again, it's about maintaining notoriety. It's about selling books to the American people. Does any of this work? Does anybody care to read about what Jim Comey thinks about his time at the FBI?
Well, you know, people want to sell books. Donna Brazile, Comey, they all have stories to tell. But what they need is something dramatic. Donna Brazile saying what she said about Hillary Clinton, him talking about ethics. Yeah, it helps sell. It helps sell books.
But how's he going to explain? I mean, he leaked a memo of a conversation to his friend in hopes to, you know, with the sole purpose of having it published in the New York Times. Doesn't that itself represent a question of ethics?
That would be the first question I would ask.
Or how about calling a criminal investigation a matter, as his boss told him to do? I mean,
well, I'd like to know who would hire him to speak on leadership. That's the other question. Like, which businesses are those? Because I'm not sure I'd want to invest in them.
Yeah, no, but I agree with you. The idea of laundering information through a law school professor and not having the courage to stand in front of the camera and say, this is what happened, this is what I think should happen, but instead, kind of behind the scenes in this sneaky way to launder it through a professor is, I think, highly unethical. And he has to explain that. I would hope that would be the first question he would address.
You know who's not going to hire him, despite it being a very left-leaning company? Apple, given the fight that the FBI had with that company over
anybody whose name has been in the newspaper will get hired by somebody, and people will come to hear him speak. People come to hear people who've had their 15 minutes of fame. That's the story of America. And the question is, will he allow hard questions to be asked? Some speakers get up, make their speech, to leave. If he allows hard questions, and if these questions are put to him, I think it'd be very interesting to see how he answers.
Can he, though? I mean, in the middle of a special investigation by Robert Mueller, I mean, wouldn't he dodge most questions?
That's the big question is, should he? Should he be doing this when there's so many questions out there about this investigation?
Especially since he's going to have to start by saying, here's what I can't answer questions about.
Most of it. And that would be most of it.
What are the ethics of that, of going out and speaking at a time when there's still so many questions?
No, I think that's all absolutely correct. This is, I think, a serious mistake by a man who unfortunately put his own reputation, what he believed would help his reputation, in front of what was best for America, and it ended up being bad for America and being bad for his reputation.
Alan, it's always great to see you. Thanks for your great insights, as always. Alan Dershowitz there.